Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the man they called Gestapo Müller and the cold, concrete depths of 1945. Imagine, if you will, the weight of the world pressing down from above. Thousands of tons of reinforced concrete, iron rebar, and scorched earth, all straining against the subterranean silence of a world buried alive. It is late April in the city of Berlin. Above the surface, the spring air should be sweet with the fragrance of linden trees and the delicate scent of the first seasonal blooms. Instead, the atmosphere is heavy with the acrid taste of pulverized brick dust, the sharp, sulfurous bite of cordite, and the thick, oily smoke of a civilization in its final, desperate hours. But down here, 40 feet beneath the gardens of the Reich Chancellery, the world is fundamentally different. It is a realm of artificial, yellowish light and the constant, low-frequency thrum of heavy diesel generators that vibrates in the very marrow of your bones. The walls are icy to the touch, weeping thin, glistening trails of condensation that look like slow-moving tears against the rough, gray cement. Here, time does not move with the cycle of the sun. It moves with the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of heavy brass clocks and the tireless tapping of typewriters that refuse to go silent, even as the end approaches. In a small, windowless office, tucked away from the frantic, sweat-stained hallways where generals and secretaries whisper of impossible escapes, sits an iron desk. It is a heavy, functional object, devoid of any ornament or warmth, its surface a dull charcoal gray. Behind it sits the man who has spent the last decade weaving a vast, invisible web of surveillance and fear across an entire continent. Heinrich Müller. At 45 years of age, he is a man of remarkably average build, possessing a face that many struggle to recall the moment he leaves a room. He is the gray man, the ultimate bureaucrat of the shadows. His hair is cropped short and disciplined, neatly parted in the exact center, showing no signs of the absolute chaos unfolding just a few meters above his head. His uniform is crisp and perfectly pressed, the silver symbols of his high rank gleaming faintly in the low glow of a single desk lamp. While others in the bunker have begun to visibly unravel, their collars undone, their eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and the numbing effects of too much schnapps, Müller remains a statue of terrifying, disciplined order. He is a man who finds his only true comfort in the structure of a file, in the definitive weight of a folder, and in the absolute, cold control he exerts over the information contained within those pages. The atmosphere in this deep sanctuary is thick, not just with the smell of damp earth and the stale, lingering scent of cigarette smoke, but with a crushing sense of claustrophobia. The ventilation system struggles to circulate the air, which feels heavy, warm, and recycled, as if it has been breathed 1,000 times over by the desperate souls trapped within. Every few minutes, a distant, muffled boom vibrates through the floor, the Soviet artillery, the heavy rockets, drawing closer with every passing hour of the night. It is a rhythmic, percussive reminder of the inevitable. Müller does not flinch when the lights flicker and hum. He does not look up when the dust, shaken from the ceiling by a nearby impact, falls like fine, gray snow onto his meticulously arranged papers. He simply brushes the debris away with a slow, deliberate motion of his hand, his fingernails clean and perfectly trimmed. He is reading reports that, in a rational world, no longer matter. He is studying the names of individuals who are likely already gone. To him, the machinery of the state must continue to turn until the very last gear is physically crushed. There is a terrifying calmness in his every movement, the unnerving serenity of a predator who knows the exit is near, even if no one else in the room can see it. If you look closely at him in the dim light, you might notice the subtle details that betray the man beneath the mask. His eyelids possess a constant, almost imperceptible tremor, a nervous tic that seems at odds with his otherwise frozen expression. His eyes are dark and unblinking, reflecting the yellow pool of the lamp as he turns another page of a dossier. We can hear the soft, scratchy sound of his fountain pen against the parchment, a slow, methodical sound that feels strangely intimate in the silence. In the hallway outside, the sound of hurried, echoing footsteps and the frantic, raised voices of the inner circle create a sharp, jarring contrast to the silence of Müller's inner sanctum. We might hear the voice of Martin Bormann, the powerful secretary, barking orders into a dead telephone line, or the soft, rhythmic sobbing of a young telephone operator who knows the connections to the outside world have been severed forever. But inside this room, with the iron desk and the stack of files, there is only the presence of the Gestapo chief. He is a man who rose from a simple police detective in Munich to the head of the most feared secret police force in human history, not through fiery speeches or charismatic leadership, but through a cold, calculating efficiency that viewed human beings as nothing more than numerical data points in a ledger of death. It is now the 20th of April, 1945. The Soviet forces are only a few city blocks away, their tanks grinding over the rubble of what was once the heart of an empire. Inside the bunker, the realization of total defeat has finally permeated even the thickest concrete walls. Müller is seen briefly in the communal areas, moving like a ghost among the living. He speaks very little. When he does open his mouth, his voice is flat and devoid of any melody or emotion, sounding like the dry, brittle rustle of ancient paper. He meets with the crumbling inner circle one last time, his presence serving as a silent reminder of the dark secrets he carries, secrets that could burn what remains of the continent if they were ever brought into the light of day. He looks at the faces of the men he has served for years and sees only the frailty of human desperation and the shadow of the gallows. He returns to his iron desk, to the sanctuary he has built for himself. He begins to burn files, not in a frantic, panicked rush, but with the same mathematical precision he used to create them. One by one, the records of a decade of state-sponsored terror are reduced to gray ash in a small metal bin. The smell of charred paper begins to fill the room, a dry, bitter scent that masks the smell of the damp earth and the dying city above. This is his goodbye, not a grand speech, but a quiet, systematic deletion of history. The shadows in the corners of the office seem to grow longer now, stretching across the floor like dark, grasping fingers reaching for the legs of the iron desk. The hum of the generator falters for a brief, terrifying moment, plunging the room into an absolute, suffocating darkness before the emergency lights kick in with a sickly, crimson glow. In that brief moment of blackness, the weight of the bunker seems to double, pressing against your chest. You can hear the sound of his breathing, slow, steady, and unnervingly calm. He is a man who has lived in the dark for so long that he no longer fears the absence of light. As the red glow bathes the room, the iron desk looks like an ancient altar, and Müller resembles a high priest of a collapsing, forgotten temple. The finality of the situation is absolute. There is no more news from the outside, only the low-frequency vibration of the earth as the city of Berlin is pounded into fine powder. We watch him reach for one final folder, his movements deliberate and strangely graceful. The chapter of the Third Reich is drawing to its violent end, but the mystery of Heinrich Müller is only just beginning to take shape in the deep, silent dark of the bunker. Close your eyes now. Feel the cold of the concrete fade. The iron desk is vanishing into the mist, leaving only the question of where the gray man will go when the lights finally go out. Heavy mahogany desk where Heinrich Müller still sat, a pillar of unsettling stillness amidst the hurricane of collapse. It was the first day of May, 1945, and Berlin was no longer a city of stone and glass, but a landscape of fire and pulverized bone. Outside the reinforced walls of the Reich Chancellery, the atmosphere was a thick, choking veil of gray and ochre. The smell of the Tiergarten burning, the ancient oaks and elms reduced to skeletal charcoal, drifted through every ventilation shaft and cracked window. The air carried the metallic tang of spent cordite and the sweet, cloying scent of decay that had become the city's new permanent resident. Müller, the man who had spent a decade weaving a web of secrets that spanned a continent, appeared entirely untouched by the hysteria around him. His uniform remained impeccably pressed, the silver thread of his rank insignia gleaming faintly in the low, yellow light of the emergency lamps. He moved with a mechanical, deliberate precision, his fingers tracing the edges of manila folders that contained the names of the dead and the doomed. Every few minutes, the floor beneath him would shudder, a deep, rhythmic thrumming caused by the Soviet artillery as the Red Army tightened its iron grip on the heart of the government district. Yet, Müller did not flinch. He adjusted a single sheet of paper on his desk, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the wood, as if the bureaucratic order of the Gestapo could somehow hold back the tides of history. The corridors of the Chancellery were a surreal gallery of the desperate. Men and women stumbled through the smoke-filled halls, their faces smeared with soot and tears, looking for an exit that didn't lead to a firing squad or a mass grave. In the shadows of the subterranean tunnels, the silence was more terrifying than the noise of the shells. It was a thick, heavy silence that pressed against the eardrums, broken only by the distant, hollow echoes of boots on concrete. Müller emerged from his office into this chaos, accompanied by his faithful radio operator, a man named Christian Scalz. They walked past the ruined splendor of the Great Hall, where the massive chandeliers lay shattered on the floor like spilled diamonds. The tapestries were shredded, and the fine Persian carpets were buried under a layer of plaster, dust as white as fresh snow. As they moved toward the upper levels, they encountered Hans Bohr, the man who had spent the last 12 years flying the world's most powerful leaders across the skies. Bohr was a man of the air, now trapped in a tomb of concrete. The two men, old acquaintances in a regime built on mutual suspicion, stopped for a brief, final moment in the gloom. The flickering light from a nearby fire cast long, dancing shadows against the cracked marble walls, making the men appear as ghosts even before they had vanished from the earth. Bohr urged Müller to join the breakout groups that were forming in the damp cellars. There were plans to crawl through the subway tunnels, to slip past the Russian sentries in the dead of night, and to flee toward the western lines where the promise of surrender seemed less terminal. But Müller looked at the pilot with eyes that were cold, clear, and devoid of hope. He spoke in a voice that was low and steady, a voice that had ordered the deaths of thousands without ever losing its calm, bureaucratic tone. He told Bohr that they knew the Russian methods exactly. He said he had not the slightest intention of being taken prisoner by the Soviets. He knew too much. He was the keeper of the most toxic secrets of the Third Reich, and he understood that for a man like him, there was no such thing as a second act in a new world. "The regime has fallen," he reportedly said, "and I fall with it." It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same detachment he might have used to report a weekly arrest tally. Bohr saw the finality in Müller's gaze, a terrifying lack of fear that suggested the Gestapo chief had already stepped across the threshold of the living. They shared a brief, firm handshake, the texture of their leather gloves a small, mundane detail in a moment of cosmic collapse. Then, Müller turned away, disappearing back into the swirling haze of the Chancellery gardens. As the sun began to set on that first day of May, the gardens of the Chancellery were transformed into a hellish theater of war. The sky was a bruised purple, illuminated by the orange flares of Katyusha rockets that screamed overhead with the sound of 1,000 tearing bedsheets. The air was thick with the dust of pulverized bricks and the bitter smoke of burning documents. Müller was seen one last time, standing near the emergency exit of the bunker, his silhouette sharp against the wall of fire consuming the city. He was still with Scalz, the two of them carrying small, nondescript cases, perhaps files, perhaps poison, perhaps the keys to a life that no longer existed. The Soviet shells were landing closer now, the concussions blowing out the remaining glass in the garden conservatory and sending shards whistling through the air like lethal confetti. Witnesses later recalled the strange sight of the two men simply stepping into the smoke, walking calmly toward the heart of the destruction rather than away from it. They did not run. They did not hide. They moved with the purpose of men who had an appointment with the void. In that moment, the man who had presided over the most efficient terror machine in human history became a phantom. The smoke swirled around him, thick and impenetrable, and when it finally cleared under the harsh light of the following morning, the space where he had stood was empty. By the 2nd day of May, 1945, the guns had mostly fallen silent in the center of Berlin, replaced by the eerie sound of wind whistling through the hollow shells of buildings. The Soviet soldiers began to pick through the ruins of the chancellery, their boots crunching on the debris of a fallen empire. They searched the bunkers, the cellars, and the shallow graves in the garden. They found the charred remains of others, but of Heinrich Müller there was not a trace. No body in a crisp uniform was found slumped against a desk. No discarded identification papers lay in the mud of the subway shafts. It was as if the smoke of the burning city had not just hidden his escape, but had absorbed him entirely. In the years that followed, investigators would pick through the testimony of survivors, trying to find a single thread that would lead them to his fate. Some spoke of a body found in a mass grave at a Jewish cemetery, buried under 3,000 others, while others whispered of a high-ranking officer seen in the back of a Soviet transport truck, his face turned toward the east. But on that night in May, as the fires of Berlin cast long, jagged shadows against the ruins, the chief of the Gestapo simply dissolved into the gray. The man who knew everyone's secrets had managed to keep his own most enduring one, the secret of his own end, buried forever in the ash and the silence of 1945. The late summer of 1945 did not bring the warmth of a typical August to the shattered heart of Berlin. Instead, the heat was a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to press the very dust of the ruins into the lungs of the survivors. The air was thick with the scent of pulverized lime, cold iron, and the sickly, sweet stagnation of water trapped in basement vaults. In the district of Berlin-Mitte, the silence of the aftermath was profound, broken only by the rhythmic, metallic scrape of shovels against stone and the distant, lonely call of crows circling the jagged skeletons of what were once grand avenues. The city had become a landscape of gray and rust, where the sun cast long, distorted shadows across mounds of debris that reached toward the second floors of hollowed-out apartments. It was within this world of ghosts and rubble that the first official conclusion to the mystery of Heinrich Müller began to take shape, emerging from the depths of a makeshift grave like a memory that refused to be forgotten. Near the sprawling, scarred remains of the Reich Air Ministry, a fortress of limestone and steel that had once hummed with the administrative power of the Luftwaffe, a small work crew labored in the oppressive afternoon sun. Their hands were calloused and stained with the soot of a fallen empire. As they cleared a path through a courtyard choked with twisted reinforcement bars and shattered glass, they came upon a shallow, provisional burial site. The earth here was loose and dark, mixed with the ash of burned documents that still fluttered in the occasional, dry breeze. Buried beneath a thin layer of soil and masonry, they discovered a body. It was not the remains of a common soldier caught in the crossfire, but a figure draped in the heavy, high-quality wool of an officer's uniform. The gray-green fabric was stiffened by the dampness of the earth, and the silver braid on the collar was tarnished to a dull, charcoal hue, but the rank of a general was still unmistakably visible through the grime. The workmen paused, the weight of the discovery hanging in the air like the dust that danced in the shafts of yellow light. With cautious, trembling fingers, an official reached into the left breast pocket of the uniform. The fabric groaned slightly as it was disturbed, revealing a small, leather-bound service identification book. The cover was worn, the edges frayed by the damp, but the paper inside remained surprisingly intact. As the pages were turned, a photograph was revealed, a man with deep-set, piercing eyes and a face that seemed carved from cold, bureaucratic stone. Beside the image, written in a precise and formal hand, was the name that had once commanded the terror of the state: Heinrich Müller. The identification seemed definitive, a physical anchor in the middle of a sea of post-war confusion. There were other items found within the pockets, ribbons and medals that spoke of a career built on the meticulous enforcement of shadow and fear. In that moment, among the ruins of the ministry, it appeared that the head of the Gestapo had finally been found, resting in the very soil he had sought to control. The remains were placed into a simple, unadorned wooden crate, the raw timber smelling of pine and fresh resin, a sharp contrast to the pervasive stench of the decaying city. There was no motorcade to escort the box through the streets, only a rattling cart that navigated the narrow, cleared paths between mountains of brick. The wheels creaked with every slow revolution, a rhythmic, haunting sound that echoed off the scorched facades of Berlin Mitte. They passed the shells of bakeries and the skeletal remains of theaters, where tattered posters still clung to the walls like skin on a ghost. The destination was the Garrison Cemetery, a place of quiet transition where the soldiers of the past were being gathered in the wake of the total collapse. The cemetery walls were pockmarked by shrapnel, and the iron gates hung slightly askew, but inside, the tall grass moved in the wind with a soft, shushing sound that felt like a collective sigh of the weary. In a corner of the Garrison Cemetery, a grave was prepared with quiet, mechanical efficiency. The soil of Berlin Mitte was heavy and clotted with the debris of centuries, yielding only slowly to the bite of the spade. Each shovelful of earth made a soft, wet thud as it was tossed aside. The men worked in a focused silence, their breath coming in short, visible puffs as the evening air began to cool. The crate was lowered into the darkness of the trench, the ropes humming with tension as they slid through the workers' gloves. When the wood finally touched the bottom, there was a brief, hollow echo that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of those standing at the edge. The earth was returned to the hole, scoop by scoop, until the surface was level and the mound was smoothed down. No headstone was erected that day. No name was carved into marble to mark the presence of the man beneath. It was a nameless grave, one of thousands in a city that was trying desperately to bury its recent history. By the time the last of the soil had been patted down, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the cemetery in a deep, purple twilight. The officials recorded the details in their ledgers with a finality that felt almost too clean. A death certificate would eventually be issued, stating that Heinrich Müller had died in the final days of 1945, his journey ending in the rubble of the ministry. For a few short months, the mystery appeared solved, the chapter closed by the physical reality of a body and a uniform. But as the wind whispered through the overgrown hedges and the stars began to flicker over the ruined capital, a sense of unease lingered. The identification had been too perfect, the uniform too well-preserved, and the circumstances of the find too convenient for a man who had mastered the art of disappearance. Beneath the quiet earth of the Garrison Cemetery, a body lay in silence, but the ghost of Gestapo Müller was already beginning to wander far beyond the cemetery walls, haunting the dreams of those who knew that in the shadows of 1945, nothing was ever truly as it seemed. The world began to change as the 1950s arrived, bringing with it a different kind of silence. The echoes of the war were fading, replaced by the low, steady hum of the Cold War. In those years, the trail of the missing Gestapo chief did not just grow cold. It seemed to dissolve into the very air. Across the Atlantic, the air was thick and heavy with the scent of tropical earth and rotting vegetation. In the port cities of South America, rumors began to bloom like night-flowering jasmine. Men with German accents and haunted eyes moved through the crowded streets of Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro, disappearing into the shadows of what the world would later call the Ratlands. These were the secret escape routes, carved through the broken heart of Europe and leading down to the sun-drenched coasts of the southern hemisphere. They were trails of shadows, marked by the exchange of forged papers in dimly lit cafes and the hushed voices of those who still held onto the old, dark allegiances. Every ship that docked in the heat of a Brazilian afternoon carried the potential for a hidden history, a passenger whose past was a jagged landscape of secrets. Imagine the stifling, heavy heat of an afternoon in Paraguay. The sound of a ceiling fan slowly cutting through the humid air creates a rhythmic click-clack that sounds like a clock counting down time that has already run out. Somewhere in a small, nondescript villa with peeling white paint and shutters drawn tight against the sun, a man might have been sitting at a heavy wooden table. His fingers would trace the grain of the dark mahogany, feeling the cool smoothness of the wood while his mind wandered back to the gray concrete of Berlin. He was a ghost in a light linen suit, his identity tucked away in a forged passport that bore a name he barely recognized as his own. The name Heinrich Müller was too dangerous to whisper, even in the safety of a jungle hideout. To speak, it was to invite the ghosts of the past to cross the ocean. Here, among the sounds of exotic birds and the distant crash of the surf, he was just another face in the crowd, a silent figure watching the horizon as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of bruised orange and deep violet. Back in Vienna, Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal spent their nights under the flicker of yellowing light bulbs, staring at photographs that were growing grainy and blurred with age. Wiesenthal's office was a labyrinth of paper, a landscape of folders that smelled of old tobacco and the dry, bitter scent of aging ink. He understood the power of a name, but he also understood the power of a void. He knew that a man like Müller, a technician of terror who had spent his life cataloging the movements of every soul in the Third Reich, would know exactly how to erase his own tracks. The frustration of the hunt was a physical weight, like the dampness of a Vienna winter pressing against the glass of the windows. Every lead was a thread that promised to pull the curtain back, yet every thread eventually snapped in the dark. Rumors reached him of sightings in the mountains of the south, where the forest is so dense it swallows all sound. There were whispers of a man who looked like the former Gestapo head living in Damascus, or perhaps working as a security consultant for a military junta in South America. But the sightings were like mirrors in a funhouse, reflecting a face that everyone recognized but no one could truly catch. The shadow of Adolf Eichmann's capture in 1960 by the Mossad had reignited a flicker of hope, a belief that even the most well-hidden predator could eventually be dragged into the light. If Eichmann could be found in a suburban street in Argentina, surely Müller was nearby, perhaps just a few houses away, listening to the same radio broadcasts in the cool of the evening while sipping a glass of wine. But as the years stretched into the 1960s, another theory began to take root, one that felt colder and more clinical. It suggested that Müller had never crossed the ocean at all. Instead of the humid jungles of the South, some believed he had remained in the gray, concrete heart of the East. The theory was that the man who had spent decades hunting communists had been swallowed by the very machine he once fought. It was said that the Soviets, recognizing his unparalleled knowledge of intelligence networks and his ruthless efficiency, had offered him a new master. In this version of the story, Müller was not a fugitive in a linen suit, but a shadow in a windowless room in Moscow or Prague. He would have been a prized asset, a living encyclopedia of secrets, teaching a new generation how to maintain the same grip of fear that the Gestapo had perfected. The search returned to the soil of Berlin in 1963, driven by the testimony of a man named Walter Lüders. He was an old man now, a former member of the civilian defense who claimed that, in the chaotic and bloody summer of 1945, he had been part of a burial detail. He remembered a body in an SS general's uniform, found in the ruins of the Reich Chancellery Garden. He swore that the identity papers on the body belonged to the Gestapo chief. On a damp, gray morning in September, the authorities gathered at the old Jewish cemetery on Gross Hamburger Strasse. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the sound of shovels striking the earth was heavy and hollow in the morning mist. They were opening grave number 611, a spot marked with a headstone that bore Müller's name and the date of his supposed death. But when the soil was finally cleared away and the wooden lids were lifted, the truth was as elusive as ever. Instead of one man, they found the remains of 3 distinct individuals. None of the skeletons matched the physical profile of the man they sought. The grave was a lie. The headstone was a ghost. As the rain began to fall once more, soaking the turned earth and the silent spectators, the realization settled over them like a shroud. The trail had not just gone cold. It had been buried under a layer of intentional confusion, leaving behind nothing but the quiet, mocking rustle of the wind through the cemetery trees. The morning of September 25th, 1963, arrived with a heavy, clinging dampness that seemed to seep through the heavy wool coats of the men gathered at the Lilienthalstrasse Cemetery in West Berlin. The sky was a bruised shade of violet and slate, offering no warmth as the sun struggled to pierce the low-hanging clouds. There was a peculiar, thick silence in the air, broken only by the distant, rhythmic hum of the city beginning its day. Here, among the rows of weathering headstones and the tangled roots of ancient yew trees, a group of investigators, forensic specialists, and stone-faced officials stood in a semicircle. Their breath blossomed in short-lived ghosts of white vapor, hanging in the still air before vanishing into the morning mist. At the center of their focus was a modest plot, a patch of earth that history had long insisted held the final remains of the most feared man in the Third Reich. The headstone was simple, bearing the name Heinrich Müller and a date of death from 1945. It was a marker that had stood as a period at the end of a dark sentence, but today, that period was being questioned. The air smelled of wet stone and the metallic tang of approaching rain, a scent that seemed to sharpen the tension felt by every person present. They were there to disturb the earth, to reach back across 18 years of silence and pull a hidden truth from the soil. The first strike of the shovel against the earth was a sharp, jarring sound that echoed against the nearby mausoleums. The soil of Berlin is often sandy and pale, but here, in the shadow of the cemetery walls, it was dark and packed tight with moisture. As the workmen began their grim task, the sound of metal sliding into grit became the only heartbeat of the scene. They moved with a slow, deliberate caution, mindful of the weight of their objective. Every shovelful of dirt thrown to the side felt like a layer of the past being peeled away. The investigators watched with narrow eyes, their hands buried deep in their pockets to ward off the morning chill. Walter Lüders had been certain. He had told the authorities that he himself had helped bury the man in the general's uniform in the summer of 1945. He had described the scene with the clarity of a haunting. The chaos of the fallen city, the smell of smoke still in the air, and the heavy, lifeless weight of a body that wore the insignia of the Gestapo chief. As the hole grew deeper, the smell of the earth changed, becoming more pungent and ancient, the scent of things long forgotten and buried deep beneath the reach of the light. The deeper they went, the more the surrounding world seemed to fall away, leaving only the pit and the secrets it promised to yield. When the shovels finally struck wood, the sound was hollow and dull, a thud that sent a shiver through the onlookers. The workmen transitioned to smaller tools, carefully brushing away the clinging clods of earth to reveal the lid of a coffin. But as the wood was cleared, a murmur of confusion rippled through the gathered men. There was not just one casket. As they worked, it became clear that the space was crowded, far more crowded than the official records of 1945 had ever suggested. The tension shifted from anticipation to a cold, creeping bewilderment. When the first lid was finally pried open with a groan of protesting nails, the forensic team, led by the meticulous Dr. Fritz Leopold, stepped forward. The light of the gray morning spilled into the dark cavity of the grave, illuminating the pale, brittle shapes of bone. But as Leopold began his preliminary assessment, his brow furrowed. He did not find a single, solitary figure laid to rest in the uniform of a high-ranking officer. Instead, the team stared down at a chaotic tangle of remains. There were 3 skulls visible in the dim light, nestled together in a way that suggested a hasty, desperate interment. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than the earth they had just moved. 3 men. 3 lives ended in the fire of the war, yet the records claimed there was only one. Dr. Leopold reached into the grave with gloved hands, his movements graceful and slow as he examined the first of the 3 skulls. The bone was stained by the earth, a mottled brown and amber, yet the structural details remained clear to his expert eyes. He measured the jaw, noted the wear on the teeth, and examined the cranial sutures with a silent intensity. After several minutes, he looked up at the officials, his voice a low, steady murmur in the damp air. This individual, he explained, was significantly younger than Heinrich Müller would have been at the time of the fall of Berlin. The forensic evidence was undeniable. The skeletal structure belonged to a man perhaps 10 years the junior of the Gestapo chief. He moved to the second set of remains, and then the third, his movements becoming more urgent as the reality of the situation set in. None of the skeletons matched the physical profile of the man they sought. There was no evidence of the specific dental work Müller was known to have, no matching bone density, and certainly no reason for 3 bodies to be occupying a space meant for one. The shock was not just in the presence of the others, but in the glaring absence of the target. The grave of Heinrich Müller was empty of Heinrich Müller. The realization settled over the cemetery like the fine mist that was now turning into a light, biting rain. The official death certificate, numbered 11706/45, which had stood for nearly 2 decades as the final word on Müller's fate, was suddenly nothing more than a scrap of paper, a fabrication of a chaotic era. The investigators looked at the empty space where a monster should have been, realizing that the record of his death had been a carefully constructed wall meant to stop anyone from looking further. The testimonies they had relied upon, the stories of burial details and found identity papers, began to crumble into the mud at their feet. If Müller was not in this grave, then the search had not ended in 1945. It had merely been paused. The wounds of the investigation, which many had hoped to heal with this exhumation, were ripped wide open. The ghost of the Gestapo chief seemed to loom larger than ever, a shadow that had successfully navigated the ruins of a fallen empire to vanish into the vacuum of a divided world. As the workmen began the somber task of reburying the 3 unknown men, the officials turned away, their faces etched with the grim understanding that the hunt was beginning all over again. The rain began to fall in earnest now, washing the dark soil back toward the hollow grave, while somewhere, far beyond the cemetery walls, the truth remained hidden in the deep, cold silence of history. The rain in Berlin-Mitte has a specific weight to it, a cold, persistent drizzle that seems to carry the faint scent of old stone and wet charcoal even now, so many decades after the fires were finally extinguished. It is a city of deep, layered history, where the modern glass and polished steel of the 21st century rest precariously upon the fractured foundations of the 19th and 20th. As the light fades over the Spree River, turning the water into a slow-moving ribbon of dark silk, the shadows begin to stretch through the Tiergarten, reaching into the hidden alcoves of the past where the records are thin, and the truth is muffled by the thick dust of lost archives. We find ourselves standing at the final precipice of a mystery that has refused to settle or go quiet, a story that does not end with a definitive gavel strike or a final confession, but with a slow, agonizing dissipation into the mist. Previously, we traced the frantic, burning final days of the bunker, the smell of cordite, and the desperate decisions made by men who knew the world they had forged in blood was collapsing. Now we follow the trail where it grows cold, where the heavy footprints vanish into the rubble of a fallen capital, and the man known as Gestapo Müller becomes less a human being and more a haunting presence in the corridors of the global subconscious. In the year 2013, in the hallowed, scholarly silence of the German Resistance Memorial Center, a historian named Johannes Tuchel sat before a mountain of yellowing documents. His fingers moved carefully over pages that had been shielded from the light for lifetimes, and there, he uncovered a death certificate that seemed to offer a final, somber answer. This fragile slip of paper, preserved against the rot of time, suggested that the most wanted man in the world had never actually left the city limits of Berlin. The records pointed toward a grave in the Berlin-Mitte district, on a site that carries a weight of profound and terrible irony. The old Jewish cemetery on Gross Hamburger Strasse had been desecrated by the secret police in 1943, its ancient tombstones shattered, and its peace violated by the very organization Müller commanded. And yet, the documents claim that it was here that a burial crew, working in the humid, fly-blown heat of August 1945, brought a body dressed in the uniform of a high-ranking general. They testified that his identity papers were still tucked inside the left breast pocket. A photo of the man himself staring out from the darkness of the fabric, as if to confirm his identity one last time. 3,000 souls were laid to rest in that mass grave, a tangle of limbs and lost names buried in the chaotic aftermath of the war. And somewhere among them, the architect of the final solution may have been slipped into the earth of the very people he sought to erase from the world. The air at the cemetery today is still and heavy, the grass a vibrant, mocking green against the gray sky, but no headstone marks his place, and no DNA has ever been extracted to prove definitively that he lies there, beneath the roots of the swaying trees. For decades before that discovery, the world was haunted by the possibility that the general had merely stepped through a mirror and into another life entirely. The name Heinrich Müller was a shield in itself, a name so common in the German tongue that it acted as a veil of white noise, generating 1,000 false leads for every true one. There were those in the intelligence circles of the 1950s and 1960s who were certain he had turned his back on the ruins and looked toward the east for salvation. Rumors rippled through the high-ceilinged offices of the Central Intelligence Agency and the dark, guarded rooms of the Soviet secret police, suggesting he had been seen in the interrogation rooms of Moscow, a man of unique and terrible expertise, now serving a new master with the same cold devotion he had shown his old one. They called him a phantom of the intelligence world, a man who knew where every skeleton was buried and held the keys to 1,000 secrets that both the East and the West were desperate to possess. Perhaps he had traded the black uniform for a gray, anonymous suit, his face unremarked upon as he walked the rainy streets of a different capital, his heart still an engine of cold, bureaucratic efficiency. The thought of him surviving, of him living out his days in the quiet comfort of a suburban home while the world searched for his ghost, is a shadow that long troubled the sleep of those who sought justice for the millions he helped to destroy. And then there were the whispers from the south, from the humid, vine-choked jungles and the sun-bleached plazas of Latin America. In the year 1967, in the sweltering heat of Panama City, a man named Francis Willard Keith was suddenly surrounded by the intense, burning gaze of the world. A woman, the widow of the missing general, looked at a grainy photograph and believed she saw the eyes of her long-lost husband staring back at her. The machinery of international law began to grind with a sudden, renewed ferocity, the pressure for his arrest and extradition building like a summer storm over the Pacific. But when the black ink of his fingerprints was finally pressed onto the white card for comparison, the patterns did not match the records of the man from the bunker. The man in Panama was a ghost, a mirage born of a world desperate to find a monster that had already slipped through its fingers like sand. The intelligence files released in the early 21st century reveal a long, winding hunt that led into countless blind alleys, a series of dead ends and mistaken identities that only served to expand the man's dark legend. He became the ghost of the Reich, a figure who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, a name spoken in hushed tones by those who believed the most senior officers of the regime could never truly vanish without leaving some trace of their passage. As we look back now from the quiet vantage point of the 21st century, the mystery of Heinrich Müller remains a hollow, aching space in the narrative of human history. He is the highest-ranking member of the Nazi hierarchy, whose end is written in shifting pencil rather than permanent ink. Whether he died in the chaotic, screaming ruins of Berlin in 1945, his body pulverized by the falling stone of the Chancellery, or buried in the anonymity of a mass grave, or whether he slipped into the long, gray shadows of the Cold War to live as a phantom, he remains a symbol of the ultimate evasion. The silence he left behind is heavy and profound, a vacuum that has been filled over the decades by 1,000 competing theories and 1,000,000 pages of frantic speculation. We are left with the image of a man who spent his life creating files and tracking the movements of others, only to become the one file that could never be closed. In the end, perhaps the most unsettling truth is that a man who helped command the most efficient machinery of death the world has ever known could simply dissolve into the air, leaving nothing behind but the cold, lingering echo of a name that is as common as the rain. The city of Berlin has rebuilt itself many times over, the scars of 1945 covered by layers of glass, steel, and new memories, but the ghost remains, drifting through the archives, a reminder of the secrets that the earth chooses to keep forever. The story of the man who vanished into the smoke of a dying empire has reached its final, quiet page. The rain in Berlin continues to fall, washing the soot from the ancient stones, while the names and the dates begin to soften at the edges of our collective memory. The hunt is over, and the questions that once burned so brightly in the hearts of investigators have finally cooled into the cold embers of history. There are no more files to open, no more graves to search in the dead of night, and no more whispers to follow through the dark. The mystery belongs to the past now, a shadow among shadows that no longer has the power to reach out and touch the present. We leave the questions behind us and return to the stillness of the room, to the soft rhythm of our own breathing, and to the safety of the night. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.